Welcome to Resilient. I'm Bill Marquard, a managing director with Monitor Deloitte and host of Becoming Resilient. During this series, we explore the connections that wide-ranging topics have to business issues and bring you insight from others in their own journeys to becoming resilient. For example, what can magic teach us about resilience? Today's guest is Dr. Will Houstoun, a performer in residence at the Medical School of Imperial College London. He helps physicians in training to develop better doctor-patient interactions from his own experience as a magician performing for audiences. Will is a PhD and a lead magician also for Breathe Arts Health Research, a London-based nonprofit. He uses magic to help young people with brain injuries develop function, cognitive abilities, self-confidence, and independence. Let's hear what tricks Will can teach us. Dr. Will Houstoun, welcome to Becoming Resilient.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Since this podcast is about becoming resilient, Will, I'm curious, how do you define resilience?
So I think it's really about being able to get to a successful outcome in whatever way you've defined success, given that you have an initial plan of how you're going to get there, but inevitably other stuff happens along the way that means you need to deviate from your plan while still keeping that overall drive towards whatever the thing you've said is success is. So in a magic show, I would often have a plan for what I'm going to do. I'm going to invite someone on stage. I'm going to ask them to do this, that, and the other, and then something amazing is going to happen. But there are all sorts of things that could happen along that journey that are either not expected at all, or which are maybe sort of expected, but not part of the ideal plan. So I might have a little thing like I need somebody to read something on stage. They don't have their glasses. Their glasses are in their bag, which is down in the auditorium. There's a whole faff with how do they get them? This is boring time. It's no interest to an audience to see that. How do you get around that sort of thing? You could have something bigger, I suppose, and sort of more outside the performance. Somebody's phone could go off. Somebody in the audience could start having an argument with somebody else. You could have an error on your part. So I might make a mistake with the things I'm doing, and I know that by this point in the trick, I should know this thing, and I don't. So the whole thing has gone off track. So all of these other little things can happen along the way. And I think resilience is sort of partly about how you deal with those in the moment to get to a successful outcome. The other sort of bigger picture side of things is how you can then use that to be able to do things better in the future. So part of it's dealing with the adversity you encounter within a given situation. Part of it is looking at what happened in that situation and how you might deal with that better in the future so that you can minimize the chance of it happening again or deal with it better next time it happens or whatever that is in the future.
Do you find that when something like that does happen in a performance, does that also even create an opportunity? Does a new trick or a new experience potentially emerge that is actually better than what you may have anticipated?
So sometimes it does. And I think that's almost more about the idea of risk, perhaps, than resilience. So as a magician, and I think in other contexts, people often think about risk as being a bad thing. It's the risk of failure. It's the risk of something not working. There's also an opportunity for something to work very, very well. I suppose an easy example is if I had somebody come on stage and choose a card and shuffle it into the middle of the deck, if I knew what that card was, when I took the deck back from them, I could have a little peek and see whether it was on the top of the deck or the bottom. There's a risk that it won't be, of course, but there's a small chance, 1 in 26, that it will be on either the top or the bottom. And if that happens, I can now do something astonishing because they took the deck, they chose the card, they put it in the middle, they shuffled the cards, they hold the deck between their hands. I snap my fingers, my goodness, their card is now on top. So there's a risk of that failing. And of course, I need a plan for the 25 and 26 times where that doesn't pan out. But there's also a chance by taking that risk that I get something better than I might otherwise have had.
When we work with business leaders, we talk about resilience being the ability to cycle through, respond, recover, thrive, and that it applies to crises, problems, risks, but also to opportunities as well. So I see how those two metaphors definitely connect.
And I think that idea of the cycle is also very, very important. So it's something that I think almost anyone who's done any kind of performance that is at least somewhat improvised will come up against, is that you have a plan for what you're going to do. In my case, a card trick. Maybe it's got a few little jokes along the way. At some point when you do that, somebody in your audience will spontaneously say something which is funnier than anything you have ever thought of saying in your life before. If you're not a great magician, maybe not a resilient magician, you get annoyed because they're taking the limelight away from you and it's meant to be about me, not about them, sort of thing. If you're a good magician, you know that that comment from the person is meant in a collaborative way. It's making the performance better for everyone. You know everyone else is enjoying it. And more to the point, you know that if you remember that joke, you can write it down after the performance. And every time you do that trick from now on, you have that new, better version based on that thing that somebody has just given you. So that cyclic thing, I think, comes into play a lot as well.
Right. And a cycle of continuous improvement then as a result, it sounds like.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Post-show reviews or post-anything reviews, I think, are another big area. The Centre for Performance Science, which is co-run by Imperial College and the Royal College of Music. And there we've looked quite a lot at feedback from the performers, surgeons, physicians, the fighter pilot trainer, all sorts of different viewpoints. And one of the huge things seems to be that after you do something, you look back at it, you say what things worked well that I need to keep doing, what was the least good thing that I can try and improve next time, and there's always that room to make it a little bit better, and how do you develop that? And one of the key things about it is that you do that every time. You don't do that just when everything's gone horribly and you feel terrible about it, and it's kind of a punishment to have to relive this traumatic experience. You do it when things work really, really well as well, because it's just part of the development. Doing the thing is part of it, reviewing the thing is part of it, and both of those together make the next time better, irrespective of how well it went on any given occasion.
When it sounds too as though honesty and self-awareness is also very critical to that process as well, right? Because if you just glance over it or you don't really effectively evaluate what happened well and what didn't happen well, that post-review isn't really as effective as it might have been.
Absolutely. And particularly when you're performing or presenting or something like this, it's really hard to review how well it went afterwards yourself, because you get either very caught up in the bit that you're not happy with, or you're very pleased with yourself when everyone claps a little bit longer than you expected at the end, that you sort of end up with a slightly skewed perspective. If there is somebody else you know there, the first thing I would do after a show is to say, have you got any notes for me? So are there any little bits you spotted that you think I should change or tweak or that didn't quite work? So you can get that feedback from a different perspective. The other thing that's hugely useful is just recording the audio of what you do in your performance. It obviously isn't the full thing. It doesn't include your actions or your slides or any of that stuff, but you can tell listening to the audio, where am I waffling? Where can I hear a bit of background chatter from the room that I need to work harder to be more interesting in? Where do I feel this has a really, really nice rhythm? So recording things is another way of looking at it from a sort of slightly detached perspective as well, I think.
I'd love to explore more about this idea of medicine and magic coming together. It seems like an unusual combination. What specifically are you doing with Imperial College of London?
I've been interested in magic for a long time, but the thing which ties together all of the stuff that I do now is looking at the way magic can be used in other contexts. So not just showing somebody a trick, but using magic to do something else. And one of the ways that works is at the medical school at Imperial College in London, where we're using magic to help medical students think about things like doctor-patient interaction and the way in which they might go about that in their future. Essentially, the basic analogy is that often if you tell people you're a magician, they think that you must know sleight of hand or psychology or have like special props, this kind of thing, and that's what magic is all about. And those are certainly all things that magicians do know about and do use, but they're not magic on their own. They only become magic when a magician uses them in a situation with an audience that could be one person or 1,000 people, and then that creates a particular experience. So none of those things really become magic until they're used with an audience and for an audience to create those little moments of wow. Similarly, in medical school, you have a lot of students who've spent ages learning all of their biology and passing difficult exams and all that sort of thing, and think that medicine is going to be about knowing physiology and anatomy and biology, and that's what they're there to do. Of course, they do need to know those things, but those things don't become practicing medicine until you use that knowledge with a patient who brings other things to the encounter to create that mutually beneficial outcome. So magic sort of stands in as a metaphor, I suppose, for how medicine can be practiced.
And it sounds like you're especially focused on experience. It's when the audience and your art come together that it creates something new, an object, an experience. And likewise, it sounds like there's that same interaction between the physician or the future physician and the patient.
In magic, I suppose it's obvious what the magician brings. They bring that sleight of hand and the performance and the magic trick and stuff. But unless there is an audience member there, it doesn't work. If I just sit in front of my mirror doing card tricks to myself, there's no magic. I know exactly what's going on. It's just a man playing with cards in his bedroom, which frankly you shouldn't be doing when you're in your mid-30s. You need to have the audience there. And the reason you need the audience there is they need to make the correct little assumptions along the way about what's happening, that the card is in the hand or has been shuffled into the deck when maybe it hasn't, in order for them to then get that moment where they go, I know this thing to be the case, but this other thing seems to have happened, and I can't explain that. And unless you have that audience there, you can't get that moment. Similarly, in medicine, it's quite clear, I think, to everybody what the doctor brings. They bring all of the knowledge, they bring the medical setting and all of those things. But the patient is the person who has the thing that needs to be fixed or needs to be worked on. And they know far more about what their experience of that is than the doctor does. So unless the doctor works with the patient, they can't bring both of those expertises together. One expertise on medicine in a general sense, one expertise on what that particular individual is dealing with medically in order to then create that solution.
To suddenly become aligned with the med school and also the Center for Performance Science. Would you tell us a little bit about how that came to being, how it was envisioned, and really what the proposition was that attracted you and Imperial College?
So it's something which definitely evolved over time. To start with, a friend and colleague, a wonderful magician from New York, just got in touch with me and said he was having a sort of one-day seminar session, which was going to feature magicians and also medical practitioners, and would I like to come along? I said yes, because that sounds like an interesting sort of a day out, but had absolutely no idea of what kind of thing might come up. And to be honest, I went to the day thinking there isn't really a similarity here. I can't see where this goes usefully. We spent the day chatting. The day was organised, it turns out, by a lovely chap who's a professor of surgical education at Imperial College. And there were lots of parallels. There were the sort of more obvious things that I suppose people latched onto early, which are things like you need dexterity if you're going to be a surgeon, you need dexterity if you're a magician, you might practice difficult manual exercises in both settings, that sort of overlap. But then there was also this broader overlap of the idea of performance, the magician as a performer, the doctor as a performer. There's the idea of creating an experience for somebody, whether it's an audience or it's a patient. And there was also the idea of a power imbalance, either because the doctor is the person in power who knows what's going on in a medical context, or because the magician is the person who has the power and can fool you or make you look silly or do a joke at your expense in the context of a show. So all of these different bits sort of became apparent during the course of this day. Some of the people who were there, I don't think, really did anything more with it. Some of the people there got quite into it. So this has all happened, I suppose, over the course of about 9 years or so.
So what is it that medicine can learn from magic? What are some of those specific lessons that have emerged over time as you've been working directly with physicians? I know you mentioned the power imbalance. I'd love to unpack that a little bit more, but I know there's some other lessons as well.
One of the big things that magicians spend a lot of time thinking about is their eyes, specifically where they're looking and when they're looking in that place. And there was a wonderful magician who was a Scottish greengrocer by trade who had a rule about looking. He said, if you want somebody to look at something, you should look at it. And if you want somebody to look at you, you should look at them. So if I wanted somebody to look at a coin that I was holding between a finger and thumb, I would look up at the coin held between my finger and thumb. If I wanted somebody to look at me rather than the coin, I would look straight into their eyes. They will sort of automatically look back up at me. It's just a way of effectively shining a spotlight that means you know where people's attention is at any given moment. Now, that's obviously useful if you're a magician, but it's also useful in all sorts of other contexts. If you're doing a presentation and you have a model or perhaps a PowerPoint slide behind you, you want people to look at, it's confusing if you talk about the thing whilst looking at people's faces, because people feel then like they should be looking straight at you, but you're telling them to look at the thing behind you. It doesn't quite feel right. Instead, if you look around at the thing whilst you talk about it, that directs everyone's attention there. Then you turn around, look back at them as you carry on talking to them. That pulls the attention back up to you. So you can use this very easily in all of those sorts of settings. In the context of doctors, it becomes a little bit more interesting again, because the follow-up to that rule is that if you don't want someone to look at something, you probably shouldn't be looking at it. In magic, that might be that if you had something hidden inside your hand, you probably wouldn't want to look at your hand because that's going to pull focus to it. In the medical consultation, that's probably that you don't want to look at something which distracts the patient in the interaction or makes them feel uncertain. And I think this will have happened to everybody listening who's ever been to a doctor's. You're telling them about something that's going wrong with you, and partway through you talking to them, they turn around and start looking at their computer screen as they type or click something, and you can't see the screen. And the thing that happens to you then as a patient is you go, their attention is clearly on something else. I can't see what that other thing is. What on earth is happening? Are they making notes? Are they checking their emails? Or are they doing an internet search because they've got no idea what's going on with you? I just don't know what's happening, and it's really uncomfortable. So just making doctors aware of that idea about eye contact and how it guides people's focus can also make you aware of those kind of stumbling blocks, like looking at your computer screen that a patient can't see partway through an encounter.
What are some of the other applications of that idea of where you're looking is where the audience's focus goes? What are some other applications of that for resilient leaders in today's business environment?
So another thing which I think is great about eye contact is it's a good way of making an authentic connection with somebody else. There's another wonderful magician who lives in Spain, and I saw him do a show in Dublin for about 200 people. And I was chatting with a few friends afterwards, and we all said that we enjoyed the show. And then each of us said that we particularly liked the fact that there was one bit in the show that he did that was like for us. And, you know, everyone else was there, of course, but there was a little bit where he kind of gave us a little smile, and we knew this bit he's doing because we chatted about something and, you know, I get to see this. And the astonishing thing about it was that we all said that was the case. And then we all said that exactly the same bit was the bit that he was doing, especially just for us. And it's because he's incredibly good at eye contact. Every time you look at somebody, it's like you check in with them. You make a little connection with them. And when you look away from people, that connection weakens a little bit. And just by thinking about that, they look at you, you look at them thing, you can make a point of checking in with people around your audience at various points. And as long as you check in with people on a regular basis, it feels as though you're talking to that person rather than just to a group as a whole. And if you can make it feel like you're chatting to somebody and this is a bit that's especially for them, that makes everything you do so much more impactful.
I also remember even from presentation skills training, one of the other techniques is that eye contact is very, very important. But I've also learned that when someone asks the tense, provocative, or a challenging question in the audience, it's always important that when you finish your answer, you're not making eye contact with that person, because it's inviting a debate or potentially inviting a lot of pushback and potential conflict. So it's interesting how the eyes can work both ways in that situation.
And it's the same rule. If you're looking at somebody, it's something that you're saying to them. And if you're disagreeing with somebody and you're talking to them, that's sort of an invitation to say something back, I suppose.
Right. What are some of those other lessons that you've learned in the doctor-patient interaction at Imperial College? What are some more of those lessons that we can extract and also apply to our role as business leaders?
So another huge thing which comes up is the idea of there always being multiple realities that are in play in any given setting. And in the magic trick, I think the multiple realities are very obvious. You have somebody who knows how the trick's done, they're hiding the card in their hand or whatever it is they're doing, and you have an audience who don't know how the trick's being done, and then they're amazed by it. So magic's a nice, easy way of highlighting those two realities. They exist, though, in all sorts of different settings. For example, if you're a doctor, as somebody's describing some symptoms to you, there's probably a bit of your brain which is thinking, I don't know what this is. It could be a cold. It might just be a thing that sprung up. Maybe it's something much, much more serious. How is this all developing? That's probably something that you want to keep in your reality, because as soon as you mention the big, serious, scary illness, that's all the person's going to be thinking about, even if it's only a tiny, tiny chance that that's the thing that is actually there. So instead, you have a slightly different reality for your audience, which is not dishonest, it's not lying to them, it's not deceiving them, but it's making sure that they do know the things that are important to them and not the rest. I suppose an equivalent in a presentation sort of a situation is that you might be worried about whether your clicker for your remote's going to work or not. Did you turn on airplane mode before you started doing your presentation? Or are text messages from your friend going to start popping up on the screen in a giant font for everyone to see? All of those different bits and pieces, which are important, but are not important in terms of the audience's reality. So just learning to think, what's important to me? I need to know about that. That's one reality. What is important to the audience is not the same thing as what's important to me. And what's important to them is the thing that I really need to try and convey as clearly as possible to them. So it's sort of splitting the perspectives out, which magic forces you to do, but which is useful in all sorts of other situations.
And Will, you've also talked about how the use of magic within that teaching context also levels the playing field. Tell us a little bit more about that.
So one of the big challenges at somewhere like Imperial, where it's a sort of a pretty good university doing a pretty high profile course that you have lots of high achieving young people at, is that everyone is sort of competing. And if you start talking about doctor-patient interaction, it's all about that world they're competing in. So these young people have spent 10 years probably at that point trying to get the best grades they can in the right subjects to get to that university. And there's a fair amount of competition in terms of who knows more, who knows less, who knows more names for different bits of the body and all of that sort of stuff. And if you're trying to have a conversation about something else, like interpersonal skills, it can be a challenge because you get people feeling insecure about what they know. Certainly, if you're mixing different year groups, you're going to get the first years feeling very nervous around the fourth years. And it's a very sort of hierarchical setting. As soon as you move to something else like magic, that disappears. So as a magician, I can tell people we're going to learn a magic trick, and none of them really care that much about how good they are at it, because none of them identify as magicians. That's not core to who they are. So we can play around with magic. The hierarchy's gone. Everyone is probably bad at this, and everyone probably has about the same amount of prior experience at it. And then everyone can explore all sorts of different ideas through having a go at a magic trick. The good bit, though, is then at the end, at Imperial, we would work with some clinicians, some of their tutors, who know a lot about the medical world. And then in a discussion with students and with the clinicians, we're able to say, here are the things that you've talked about in magic, and here's how you can pull this out and apply it into the medical context. So it sort of provides a safe place to explore these different ideas about interaction, eye contact, practice, all of these different things when they're playing with a magic trick, and then allows them to jump back into the medical context and look at how these ideas are useful to them there.
Early on in the discussion, we talked about metaphors, and that is exactly what you're pointing to are a lot of the great benefits of metaphors. It creates a common playing field. It creates a common language. It potentially provides an opportunity to learn and grow in a more nurturing environment. So there's so many of those parallels along the way, and I see more and more how magic as a metaphor and as a craft can be very effective in the medical profession and many others as well. You've also talked about how in a magic performance, it's based on assumptions about ways the world works and how you use those ways or those assumptions to a surprising effect. Would you unpack that a little bit more? And I think for us as leaders, we need to also understand what are the assumptions that our teams, that our customers, that our vendors, our whole system is potentially bringing into a conversation or into a transaction.
So I think it's really interesting because magic is fundamentally about assumptions. Every single magic trick is an example of somebody seeing something, assuming something about what they're seeing, which is probably not quite right, and then the magician exploiting that to do a trick. And it's sort of dishonest, I suppose, in an exploiting assumptions kind of a way, but it's also honest because it's within this framework of I will do a trick for you, it won't be harmful, all of these sorts of things. So when you get to that moment where the assumption is made, magic exploits it. And of course, everyone has to make an assumption to get by in day-to-day life. For example, if somebody puts a coin in their hand and closes their hand about it, the best way to function in the real world is to assume that the coin is still inside that person's hand. If somebody goes behind something as they're walking along the street, the best way to function is to assume that the person is still behind it until they walk out on the other side. But if you're a magician, you're probably going to try and exploit that. So I might try and work out a way of pretending to put a coin in my hand that made it look like it was there, but when it really wasn't, people will assume that the coin is still in my hand. And because they assume it's there, I can make it seem to disappear when I show you that my hand is empty. The real power in magic, I think, is that it proves just how basic those assumptions can be. Because we do this all of the time, as humans, we tend to not think we're making all of these assumptions. But a magic trick like making a coin disappear proves that you can make assumptions about things as fundamental as is he holding that or is he not holding that? And if you can make assumptions about things that are so fundamental, of course, you can be making assumptions about all sorts of other things too. So I would say that the real strength of magic is not so much that it points out a specific assumption that people make, but rather it points out just how much of the time we're making these assumptions. Because the benefit is not perhaps going, people do make assumptions about things being held in hands. Rather, the benefit is to go, I now know that I am making these assumptions all of the time. I have to make these assumptions function in day-to-day life. It's part of what it is to exist as a human. But if I don't know that I'm making assumptions, that could be dangerous. So magic's that little reminder that you are making assumptions all of the time, and it's worth remembering that.
And when you're trying to develop a new trick, do you start with the trick and then figure out what are the assumptions that will make that work? Or do you sometimes start with the assumptions and figure out a way to take advantage of those in configuring something that's an experience for the audience?
That's a really interesting question, and one, again, that I think applies in all sorts of different settings. So there are essentially two components to a magic trick, if we can just go into magic jargon for a moment.
Sure.
One of them is the effect. And the effect might be a signed card that's shuffled into the pack, disappears and appears inside the magician's wallet. The other of them is the method. And the method might be that you've managed to get a second card with their signature on it without them knowing, and you've somehow put that in your wallet and they don't know about it, so then you can make it appear to be there. So the method is how it's done, and the effect is the sort of story of what's apparently happening. Often, magicians come up with magic tricks by going, oh, hang on a minute, here's a new little method I could use. What trick could I do with it? And a lot of the time, those are not particularly good tricks because they start by saying, what tools do I have available to me? And then they say, what thing can I do as dictated to me by the tools that are available to me? So you're very much doing something based on what tools you have available rather than what you actually wanted to do. A better magic trick is always led by the effect. So you start off by saying, what impossible thing would I like to happen? What impossible thing do I think would be interesting to happen? What thing do I think other people would like to see happen? What thing would tell an interesting story about who I am or the way the world works or the times we're living in? And then after you've come up with that effect, so you're not worrying at all about how to do it, you then say, I know what my effect is. I have that clearly defined. Now I'm going to start looking at the tools I already have and the new tools I could acquire to see how I might go about creating that effect. And if you do that, you always end up with a better magic trick, because you end up telling a story, an effect that you want to tell, rather than going, oh, I figured out this funny little thing I can do with a playing card. What might I do with it? Never the best way of coming up with a magic trick. So I think thinking in terms of effect, then working out method, rather than starting with the method that's available and coming up with an effect, is always better. And I think that applies in other contexts too, quite often.
Well, because when you think about business leadership and strategy and things like that, starting with the method almost implies incrementalism. I'm going to use this method, then I'm going to use this method, then I'm going to use this method. Whereas effect is turning it 180 degrees different. I'm starting with the end in mind. I'm casting a vision. I'm casting an effect for the future, and then working backward to figure out what methods I need to put in place, what strategies need to be there, what must be true in order for the organization to ultimately achieve that effect.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you start with the methods, you are inevitably going to change something in the world, but quite what it is and quite in what way, you have no particular idea. So far better to start by saying, what do I want to change in the world? And then say, how am I going to go about doing it? I would argue.
Well, yeah, amazing advice. You also say that magic tricks occur more than one time and they occur at more than one level. And I think there's some great lessons in there for us as leaders also.
Yeah, so I would say that the magic trick happens 3 times. And this is certainly a model that I've used with doctors as well. And they seem to agree in their world, although they perhaps hadn't thought about it in quite the same way. In the context of a magic trick, it happens 3 times. It happens once when the magician shows you the trick and you experience it there and then in real time. It then happens a second time when you recall what happened. Perhaps you're on your tea break later on, you're on the bus on the way home, driving home, whatever it is, and you think, oh yeah, this thing happened today and I saw this magician and they did whatever it was they did. The third time, which doesn't always happen, but often does, is that you re-experience the magic trick when you describe it to somebody else. So you get home, you're chatting with your partner or your children or whoever it is, and you say, oh, I saw this magician today, they did this thing, this is what happened. And all 3 of those different versions of the trick will be different versions of the trick. The live one has everything in it. There's no way of missing out any steps or avoiding any bits or anything. You can make bits feel important or less important, but it all has to happen. When somebody remembers the trick, though, they are not going to remember all of it. They won't remember all of the detail because nobody ever does remember all of the detail. It's sort of back to that assumptions idea. Instead, they're going to remember the bits that you have tried to make seem as important as possible. And if you've done that carefully, those will be the bits that tell the best version of the trick that happened. So they don't remember that you showed a coin in one hand, then put it in your other hand, and then snapped your fingers and then made it disappear. They just remember you held a coin in your hand, snapped your fingers, and it disappeared. And if they make that small omission of passing it from one hand to another, they've now removed the moment when you did the sneaky thing that makes the trick happen. So the version they remember is better than the version that they actually saw. The chances are that when they tell somebody else about the trick, they're then going to edit it again, because you're not going to say all of the things that run through your head when you remember something to somebody else. So if you've been careful about it, you might have suggested that when you snapped your fingers, it wasn't just that the coin instantly disappeared, but rather it sort of got lighter and lighter, and then you crumbled it with your fingers and then sprinkled it into dust, and then eventually it was gone. And if you manage to suggest that well enough, there's a fair chance that the person who saw the trick will go home, say, I saw this magician, he did this amazing thing, had a coin in their hand, and then as they crumbled it, it slowly sort of sprinkled away into nothing. I thought maybe it was behind just a single finger, very, very small, and then they opened their hand and it was gone. And now you have an even better version of the trick, as far as the person who's told that story is concerned, than even the version that the person telling the story remembers. So you've got the trick when it happens, the trick when someone remembers, and then you've got the trick when they tell somebody else. In magic, those 3 stages are all just about making the trick as good as possible. In other contexts, they can be, I suppose, important in very different ways. In a medical example, if you have a 5-minute consultation with your doctor, there are all sorts of things that are going to happen. There's bits of who's sitting where, there's bits of rearranging papers, there's bits of small talk, there's bits of what's been going on with you, what kinds of things are you feeling, and there's bits of these are the kinds of things it might be, and these are the kinds of things we're going to do. Those are all stages that have to happen in that consultation. You probably don't need to remember all of that, though. So a good GP will be thinking, what are the key things I need the person to remember? I need them to remember that we have discussed this in a way that seems full and adequate. I need them to remember that I want them to do this thing for the next 2 weeks, take these pills once a day or whatever it is. And I want them to remember that in 2 weeks, if it hasn't got better, they need to make an appointment to come back and see me. So as a GP, you'd be thinking, those are the bits I need the person to remember. Let's design it to make sure that happens. And then again, those 3 bits that they need to remember are more likely to be the bits that they tell the other person about later on. Probably they don't say, I had a good chat, I felt well listened to, that was all important. They just say, I've got these tablets, I take them once a day, and if it's not better, I need to go back in 2 weeks. Those are the important things somebody else might then remind them about to make sure that stuff happens. So you can think about those 3 stages in terms of what your patient wants to do. I suppose if you're working with a team or in a sales meeting, you have exactly the same thing. People don't need to go away with all the information, but you very much do want them to go away with some of it in a very clear way.
Right. And you can't ultimately control the narrative, but what you can control are the parts that you emphasize and the parts of the experience that have the greatest opportunity for the narrative to stick. You know, if you're trying to communicate change within the organization, if you're trying to communicate a shift in strategy that the organization needs to get behind, introduction of a new computer system, which creates a lot of behavior and process change. In all those situations, there's a macro narrative, but you need, using your techniques, you need the person, the employee, the team member to ultimately walk away, hopefully, with the micro narrative of what's in it for them and also what they need to do with it. So
yeah, absolutely. And I suppose thinking about the thing that will have the most impact on a person is the thing they're likely to remember. So if you can make that thing the thing you want them to remember, that's great. The thing which makes their life better is a big thing people care about. So if you can make that a point you want them to take away, that's great. And the thing which is the best anecdote to tell somebody else later is also probably the thing that they're going to remember and maybe talk about later on. So if you can make one of the points in a great joke or a clever little story or something someone's going to want to share with somebody else later on because it had an interesting visual associated with it or something, then that's a great way to make that piece of information sticky. So that's one of the things that the person takes away with them.
Well, when I first met you, I was a participant in a team building event where you were doing a magic performance. Tell me how you responded in this COVID environment and how you came to a video conferencing platform with all this electronic distance between you and the rest of the audience.
It was a heck of a thing, as I'm sure COVID
yes,
was.
Yes, it was. On this side of the screen, it was too. So
essentially, when COVID first sort of came up, a friend and I were chatting about magic tricks, and we, in our infinite wisdom, thought that maybe COVID would be around for a few months rather than the few weeks that people were talking about, and that it might be quite fun to be able to do a magic trick for somebody on a video conferencing platform. It seemed like a fun idea. It seemed like something that might be nice to think about. We considered sort of selling something to other magicians, but then decided that seemed a bit unfair because it was sort of based on hardship that the world was undergoing. So instead, we decided we would think a lot about magic tricks that might work on video. We would chat with all of our friends and find out what kinds of things they thought might work on video. We'd post all these things as blog articles and magicians could subscribe to them, but the subscription money would then be donated to charity to help mitigate COVID's impact in third world countries. Along the way, we collected all sorts of thoughts about how you could move magic onto a video conferencing platform. And the biggest realization, I think, is the one that's most important for everyone, which is that this is its own performance space. So we should try and do things here that are possible here in a way that they never would be anywhere else, and which take full advantage of this medium and the things that it allows. So by way of example, at the show you came to, there were 3 cameras, so you could see things from different angles that you would never get if you were there in a theatre. And we were able to perform it for a group of 30 people all around the world, and it didn't matter that people were in all sorts of different locations. Taking things a step further, I've done shows on video for audiences in their hundreds, and you could never get an audience that's measured in its hundreds to chat amongst itself and come up with things that then can be factored into a trick. On a video conferencing platform, it's incredibly easy. You just pop everyone into a breakout room, bring them back after a minute, and then you can call on people individually by spotlighting them, unmuting them, and they can contribute to the show. So in a very real way, you can have 100 people, they can all go off and meet somebody they've never met before in this audience, chat with them, get to know a little bit about them, then come back into the main show space and interact with the show. And you physically could not do that in any theatre I've ever seen. So it's all about saying, it's a new setting. What does it make possible that I would like to do? And how can I best take advantage of the opportunities that it creates while still being aware of the challenges it presents?
Well, and there you're interacting method and effect along the way as well, because there's certainly an end game effect that you were looking for. But in this situation, you were actually able to leverage and take advantage of some of the methods that a video conferencing platform potentially offers to you. So
I suppose an example of that, which does tie back with the effect idea really, is a trick that magicians have done for years, is making something disappear in one place and reappear in somebody else. And most of the time it's disappear from one hand, reappear in the other hand, or maybe disappear from the magician's hands and appear in between the spectator's hands, but it happens in the same space. On video, we thought, wouldn't it be a great version of a trick to do if you could have something in the magician's hands in London disappear and then have it appear in a spectator's hands who's in San Francisco? It's a challenge to come up with a method to make that happen. We did come up with a couple of methods that can make that happen, and there are several people who are making things disappear and cross the Atlantic potentially as we speak because of it. But it's thinking about what exciting tricks could be possible. What are the new effects that are available?
And it probably breaks the thinking through to new ideas of ways of doing tricks that you hadn't even expected before. It's finding those new effects that go with the methods. So
yeah, absolutely.
I know you've been very passionate about a charitable organization called Breathe Arts Health Research. Tell me a little bit about that organization, what it seeks to accomplish, role that has in the world, and also what really drives your passion for the group.
So Breathe Arts Health Research is a not-for-profit organization in London, which was started, or the idea was started by a wonderful magician, a good friend, a very sort of high-profile lawyer in London, but always has loved magic, always has wanted to do magic, always has had magic as a hobby. Never wanted to do shows particularly, but thought maybe there would be room to do some good with magic. So he ended up pitching this idea around a number of hospitals in London, ended up meeting some like-minded people who thought maybe there was something in this. And from those meetings, over the course of the last 10 years, this organization, Breathe, has grown and flourished. In terms of magic, the main program that we do is with young people with a condition called hemiplegia. Hemi as in half and plegia paralysis. So it's something a little bit like a stroke, which affects the movement on one side of the body. And we work with young people between about 7 years old and about 18 years old who have this condition. Now, the challenge with it is that if you can't do fine motor skills with one of your hands, a lot of day-to-day life becomes much more difficult. So a lot of these young people can't do things like do up buttons, do up zips, cut up food with a knife and fork, push open a door with 2 hands, all sorts of different things that are really important if you want to live a fulfilling, independent life. But the way to fix them is occupational therapy. And the kinds of exercises that a therapist wants you to do are things like pick up a coin and drop it in a cup, then tip it out of the cup and pick it up and put it back in again. And do that for 15 minutes every night of the week for the next month. No 9-year-old in their right mind is ever going to do that exercise that much. So instead, a group of therapists and a group of magicians got together. The therapists explained which actions would be most useful for these young people to practice, and the magicians then went away, looked at the kinds of tricks that we might be able to teach a young person, and found ones that incorporate those actions. The young people then come on a 2-week intensive therapy camp where they learn to become magicians. At the end, they do a professional magic show in the Magic Circle, which is the most prestigious magic club in the United Kingdom. And in this show, they do all sorts of magic for their friends and their family. And these are young people who've never done magic before in their lives. But alongside that, they are really keen to learn magic. So if we teach them a trick, which includes pinching things and picking them up and dropping them in a cup, and we tell the children to practice for 5 minutes, there's a fair chance their parents come in the next day and say, we're very sorry, we had to confiscate the magic tricks. They wouldn't go to bed after an hour of practice because they wanted to keep doing it. And because the young people are so motivated to practice these actions, they make huge, huge improvements. So in the space of just 2 weeks, we've had young people do up buttons for the first time, tie shoelaces for the first time, cut food with a knife and fork for the first time, and be able to go away doing all of these things with a new degree of independence.
It's just an amazing story, and I'm curious, what are some of the stories that you're most proud of, the changes that have occurred in one or more of your folks' lives?
So there's one young man called Josh who came on the camp. He was very, very good, had quite a tight hand, so quite difficult to manipulate it, but very, very enthused by magic, really, really liked it, did really well, did one of the most difficult tricks we teach in the final show, but did find it really quite nerve-wracking. He didn't want to do the show particularly. He decided he would because his friends were doing it too. He was a bit scared. A little bit later, he came back and he helped out on one of the camps that happened later. Then he became a Breathe Magic mentor. So he now comes to all of the camps as a young person with hemiplegia who can relate to what these other young people are going through because he did it himself as well. And he helps teach them the tricks and share some of his thoughts on how they can do things like shoelaces, etc. He drives a car, he's independent, he's gone to university. And just before COVID happened, he also became the first person from a Breathe Magic camp to pass his exam to become a member of the Magic Circle. So from little Josh, who couldn't do magic tricks and couldn't do his buttons, he's now young man Josh, I suppose, member of the Magic Circle, able to do tricks really well and able to drive around, look after himself, and has a wonderful life.
Wow, what an amazing legacy that the organization's already created. So,
although largely down to Josh, of course, like none of that would have happened without him. So.
Right, and his commitment and his persistence and his resilience to respond to the disease and the condition that he had, and be able to achieve such remarkable things. You know, there was something else that's connecting some dots in our conversation. The word like-minded came up. You talked about the fact that when the nonprofit was being put together, it was a matter of going around to a number of hospitals until you found a like-minded person. I think about earlier in the discussion about how you first became involved with Imperial College. It was a matter of finding some like-minded people. And I think about our role as business leaders, and maybe we've got an idea or an innovation that seems a little bit far-fetched. And the persistence and perseverance that we need to have to find like-minded people for the movement to begin, for us to be able to connect dots in order to make things greater than ourselves happen. And, you know, that's one of the other messages and one of the other learnings I'm taking away from our conversation that's fascinating, that reinforcement of the persistence and the time and the effort. But it's all well worth it to find those like-minded people that can come along with us, and we can pour into their lives as well.
Absolutely. And I really do think that's something which underpins a lot of this. So I'm sure, well, I know for sure, there are plenty of medical practitioners who would think learning magic tricks as part of medical school is sort of on the lunatic fringe of what you might consider doing. I'm sure there are fighter pilots who'd say the same thing, musicians who'd say the same things. Yeah, lots of people would say this stuff is all a bit out there and a bit wacky, I think. But when people get it, they really seem to get it. And I think the thing that happens is that if somebody comes to any of these interactions, whether it's magic to business or magic to medicine or any of these other settings, a lot of people come to it looking for points of difference. So they say, well, this is a business executive, this is a magician. They don't have anything in common. They live in different places. They do different jobs. One's employed, one's self-employed. There's nothing to connect them. I think the people who make all of the interesting jumps are the people who say, of course, there are loads and loads of differences between people who work in different fields and people who live different lives. But there are also inevitably going to be points of similarity and points of connection. So let's try and have an open conversation. Let's look for things that inform each other's worlds and which resonate with each other's worlds as we chat. And let's see what kinds of things grow out of that. Sometimes those conversations are interesting and fun and they lead to nothing. Sometimes they're interesting and fun and they lead to a 10-year collaboration that develops all sorts of great ideas. But approaching things with that openness and looking for connection rather than looking for difference seems to be a better way forward, I think.
Also, that's great wisdom for human relationships and great wisdom for humanity. It's not just about business, but how do we find those things that make us similar rather than those things that make us different? So it's a profound philosophy that you've shared with us as well. Will, thank you for sharing the surprising variety of applications that magic offers. The simple truth of a magic trick is that we make an assumption. And your stories reinforce that reminder that we're making assumptions constantly in our daily lives. And it also reminds us that everybody we interact with is making their own assumptions that we need to be aware of and cognizant of. Will, the work you've done to explore the connections of different disciplines is trailblazing. Making those connections isn't always easy, but when we persevere and find like-minded people, incredibly powerful ideas, approaches, and innovations can happen. Your work is certainly a testament to it. I especially enjoyed the discussion of the two components of a magic trick, method and effect. It's a great metaphor to help keep us pointed towards our own North Star while we navigate the side trips along this journey. Those side trips are really what fortify our own resilience as leaders. Finally, the creativity magicians conjure up to help young people with disability improve their quality of life is inspirational. Particularly, it causes us to consider what is it that we're talented at, that we're good at, that could potentially be a tool and a resource to make the lives of others so much better. If you're curious about how other leaders are navigating their own paths to becoming resilient, I encourage you to visit our Global Resilience Hub at Deloitte.com/resilience. Until next time, stay curious, find the connections, and continue your journey of becoming resilient.